We just finished a study where we brought 17 different technologies to a single landfill at the same time. We had satellites, we had aircraft, we had helicopters, we had drones, we had people with measurement devices in pickup trucks and golf carts, and people walking with backpacks, sniffers, if you will, to test that. So if we can better measure how emissions are formed, and we can measure like what kind of emissions are created, then that gives us a better perspective on how to potentially address that.
Hi, folks. I'm Conor Gaughan, and welcome to Consensus in Conversation, a podcast where we're talking to the innovators, entrepreneurs, and thought leaders who are committed to building successful businesses that also help us build a better world. As of this episode, I've been joined by more than 80 amazing guests on the show and counting. And we've covered a true variety of fascinating companies, each one with their own unique approach to making a positive impact. We've had some that are truly one-of-a-kind innovators, like the biomachines Pavel Yeremik is building at Aether, or the 3D graphene Keith Norman is helping to create at Lighten. But we've also had a number that fall into some of the bigger, broader categories, which makes sense, since when it comes to climate tech, the big problems crying out for solutions aren't exactly mysteries at this point. Renewable energy and energy storage, electrification, carbon sequestration, regenerative agriculture. But there's still a lot of room within these categories for different kinds of solutions. And I love how meeting with different guests, all working on these problems from different angles, creates a kind of ongoing conversation for us. And one of these ongoing conversations that we spent some of the most time on is around waste. In part, that's because it's an issue I find particularly important, since it's one of the climate-adjacent issues in which each of us as individuals can really make a difference with our choices. But it's also important just because of its scale. You've heard me quote this number before, but it's always worth repeating. The decomposition of organic waste in landfills alone is responsible for nearly 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. That's to say nothing of the impact of all the inorganic waste that's also produced each year, which has a ton of environmental knock-on effects. On the show, we've explored this waste issue through a number of intriguing lenses that our guests have brought to the problem. Last year, we spoke with Nick Whitman, the co-founder and COO of Divert, who spent 16 years successfully building and scaling a company aimed at eliminating food waste by revolutionizing food waste logistics and converting what can't be salvaged into energy-grade natural gas via anaerobic digesters. One of my favorite ever convos on the show was with Matt Rogers, co-founder of Mill, who's putting the product design skills he learned from the masters at Apple to work making composting frictionless through high-tech bins, which I personally can attest is an idea that works really well. On the other end of the food waste equation, we spoke recently with folks like Josh Dominguez of Flash Food and Jasmine Crow-Houston of Gooder, both of whom are working to prevent food waste before it happens. Josh by building an app that helps stores sell their near-expiration products by offering big discounts to folks looking to save on their grocery bills, and Jasmine with advanced supply chain logistics and inventory management that help businesses take advantage of tax credits by getting food surplus to those in need. Beyond just food waste, we've also had awesome conversations like the ones this season with Ben Christensen of Cambium and Christy Kaler of Trashy. Ben is helping revolutionize lumber supply chains with Cambium's Carbon Smart Wood, preventing millions of tons of local wood waste from ending up in landfills, rotting away and emitting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, by transforming fallen or removed trees into locally sourced carbon-negative material that also makes beautifully unique wood pieces. Christy, meanwhile, is taking the fashion industry by storm with Trashy and its iconic take-back bags, which customers can fill with unwanted clothing and accessories to be recycled and earn Trashy cash to spend with Trashy's impressive partnership network of well-known brands. With the rise of fast fashion sending 85% of used clothing currently to landfills, Trashy's approach is a huge step towards circularity for the fashion industry, donating clothing that can still be worn and recovering materials that can be reused, and making it worthwhile for customers to make that possible. I'm super excited about all the different ways entrepreneurs are looking at tackling the problem of waste today. There's also one thing that unites them all. They're all building off of what the science tells us are the best ways to manage all of our waste. If you're like me, when you begin to spend enough time on a topic, a particular question begins to arise. Where does the science that all these innovators are following actually come from? So today, we're taking a brief detour from our usual focus on businesses to answer that question, at least when it comes to waste. My guest on Consensus in Conversation today is Dr. Bryan Staley, President and CEO of the Environmental Research and Education Foundation, or EREF for short. an awesome institution that's dedicated to advancing the circular economy and sustainable resource management through unbiased scientific research and education around waste management. As a man who grew up on a farm and spent his entire life in pursuit of environmental science, Bryan knows a thing or two about organic waste, agriculture, and the deep and sometimes strange nuances behind how our materials break down. We're exploring how EREF is shaping more sustainable waste management practices, the complexities of dealing with PFAS, or forever chemicals, landfill emissions, and even the science of textile recycling. Whether you're an innovator, fellow scientist, or policymaker, Bryan is well worth a listen. The subject may be trash, but his ideas are a treasure. So without further ado, let's get into my conversation with one of the leading minds in environmental research and waste management, Dr. Bryan Staley. Well, let's start at the very beginning. How about an easy question to tee us off? We're going to dig in a lot to what the foundation does. But before we do that, I want us to start with a little bit about you and just where are you from originally? What was it like growing up?
So I was born in what at the time was rural Maryland, which is a rather large dairy farming community. And from there, we moved around a little bit. My mother was in the National Park Service. And so we ended up in various places through the years. She worked for the Appalachian Trail. So we moved to a farm in West Virginia. And then she worked for the Carl Sandburg home in North Carolina, which is how we found ourselves in the mountains of North Carolina and did some farming there. So always was involved in farming. My father was a farmer as a kid and continued that profession, but we basically tended to go where my mother went and where her career took her, and we just continued to farm there. So yeah, I kind of moved up and down the eastern seaboard.
Awesome. Did you happen to see someone last week set a brand new record for the speed with which they hiked the Appalachian Trail? Did you see this?
No, I didn't.
A woman did it in a matter of like days. I mean, it was more than just days, but it was like the fastest hike of all time for the Appalachian Trail. And it happened, I believe, last week. Also, I'll look it up. It's pretty cool. Well, I'm curious, you think about, growing up on and around farms. Was it something that you enjoyed? How might it have shaped your kind of perspective on the world or your career trajectory?
That's a great question. It affected me profoundly. I really started as a young kid. My father put me on a tractor raking hay at the ripe age of 10 years old. So I couldn't even reach the pedals, but I'm an only child. So he needed the help. And once I was of a certain age, he said, well, you can drive a tractor. Let's do it. I think one of the things that it did for me is it really brought me close to the world around us, so close to nature. I mean, you got to see everything from animals to how things grow, and it gives you a big sense for how does the environment impact us and how do we impact the environment. So it was pretty profound for me and ultimately led to making a career choice in the environmental area as I got older.
Do you look back? I had for Father's Day, I did a special edition where I interviewed my dad, who grew up on the family farms also. And it was really interesting. He had a handful of lessons from the farm that he felt really informed how he thought about business. I'm curious, kind of, growing up on the farm, are there just any lessons about farming that you think translate directly into building organizations or running organizations?
Yeah, I think part of it is knowing that when you put effort in, you tend to get something good out of it. But you have to be patient in many cases. I mean, we live in such a instant gratification society today. And I think one of the big things that I took away is that, you can move a mountain, but it may take time to move that mountain. And the same is true of farming. I mean, many times you're preparing in the winter to plant a field that you don't plant until the spring. And once you plant that field, I mean, you've got to take care of it. You've got to nurture it, make sure the weeds don't take over, make sure it has enough water and fertilizer to grow. But you don't see the fruit of that effort. You literally don't see the fruit until 3 to sometimes 4 months later. And then once you harvest that, it's time to do it all over again. And so, I think it taught me a lot of lessons about one, planning, good planning. Farmers must be good planners, or you're not going to be profitable. And just patience, being able to nurture. And I think that has a lot of lessons, especially from a leadership perspective, because while leaders may not be growing corn, for example, you are nurturing and growing your team. Yeah. And the team is that asset that, as a crop is an asset to a farmer. And so in many respects, being able to nurture your team, help the team grow, yield a lot of fruit later down the road.
I love that. You continued, an agricultural focus through your undergrad, studying, I think, biological and agricultural engineering. At what point did you kind of figure out what you wanted to be when you grew up?
So I started out as a consultant in the ag engineering sector. And so I really enjoyed that. I think as I got into that career path shifted into something that would be called more of a site civil focus, where we were doing land development work. And I think it was there that I realized that I really want to do something that can help change the world. Not that it wasn't changing the world, but it was just a different focus. I wanted to get back to those environmental roots and how can we impact the world for the better. And all along that time frame, climate change and emissions and pollution were continuing to just sort of build up in my awareness zone. And ultimately, I decided to go back and get a doctoral degree. And that was spurred in large part by the desire to want to make a larger impact in my career and
Yeah.
figuring out how am I going to do that. So I thought, well, I really enjoy research. I do like the business side of things. How can I try to marry those up? And so I originally wanted to go towards the academic sector, and I was actually on that trajectory and ultimately got a scholarship through the Environmental Research and Education Foundation, which led me into a position that allowed me to do both. I have one foot in that business sector and one foot in the research sector,
Sure.
and it's been a lot of fun ever since.
That's my next question, is to walk us through that trajectory. But before we do that, I'm just curious, at what point in that process did this notion of waste as something central to how we need to think about problem solving come to you? Was there a particular point in your research or particular event or experience that really catalyzed your interest or understanding that this was going to be something you wanted to focus on particularly?
You know, I completely fell into it, almost randomly, if you will, or some might say, I got hit by the garbage truck while I was trying to do something else. Not really, but figuratively, I did. I was actually in the process of moving into a doctoral program, and I was talking to different professors, and I really wanted to do DNA and microbial fingerprinting. I used to watch CSI when I was younger, and I was like, oh, that's just really cool how they use DNA to figure things out. And I thought, well, I want to do that kind of in an environmental sense, be CSI for the environment and figure out, which microbes do what. Because a lot of the things that happen that impact the environment are microbially driven. We may not realize that. So I thought if I could do some of that, that would be really neat. And along the way, one of the professors I was talking to said, hey, have you ever thought about getting into solid waste? And like without a second, I was like, no, not really. And as I slept on and thought about it more, I started looking into it and realized, that there are a lot of things happening in the solid waste field that could use better science and more science. And so I kind of went back to that professor and said, you know what, let's talk again. And ultimately, he became one of my advisors for my doctoral program, and I ended up still doing DNA fingerprinting work, but as applied towards solid waste. And so I ended up being able to kind of marry that passion of wanting to understand how molecular fingerprinting works with the solid waste side of things.
I always ask, and some folks remember, others don't, but do you remember what exactly was the title of your doctorate paper? I think it's always entertaining to hear how folks actually, articulate what it is they spent that time doing.
Yeah, it's been a while now, but it was something along the lines of methanogenesis initiation and its impact on landfill emissions.
I love it.
Yeah, it's a mouthful. I'm sure there's probably only 3 people that probably have read it. So
we can put that in the show notes. We can go find it and put it in the show notes for folks.
There we
afterwards.
go. There we go. All 400 pages if you want to take a read.
So you end up working in a variety of environmental engineering and waste management kind of roles prior to EREF. And I'm curious, kind of as you look back, any that stand out as having set you on the road towards where you are now, or any main takeaways from kind of the phases of your career that kind of got you to where you are?
I'm the kind of person where every situation that I get in, I kind of look for what's the thing that I can take away from this, whether it's good or it's bad. And so I look at everything that's happened to me career-wise, even personally, as opportunities to sort of take something from that and better myself, better the world around me. So if I think about, even the work that we were doing to design subdivisions, which doesn't sound like a very environmentally friendly activity, but, from an environmental standpoint, I was delineating wetlands so that they didn't get built over. I was performing environmental site assessments to figure out how to remediate underground storage tanks. And so even though we were doing land development, there were a lot of environmental components to that. Of course, going back further in the ag sector, a huge portion of what we were doing was to figure out how to sustainably manage animal manure. If anybody in the audience is a meat eater, that's one of the things that come out of raising animals, whether it's for consumption or for milk or whatever. discover is that they make a lot of manure. And so designing nutrient management plans that can basically not pollute the waterways and things like that are a critical piece of those operations. And then moving into more of the research space, the same thing is looking at these different experiences. One of my first experiences as a PhD student was operating a lab-based reactor, a number of them actually, where we had to monitor them every 3 hours, 24/7. So it was me and one other student, and we were basically flipping a coin for who got the 3 a.m. slot. But that taught me, similar to the farming, it taught me that perseverance and persistence of just staying with it,
Yeah.
and we ended up with some fantastic results. But it's those kinds of things where it's like doing the things that need to be done when you don't want to do them tend to be some of the most important activities you can take on sometimes.
Yeah. You alluded to this, but you did part of your research as an EREF scholar, and then now are kind of at the helm of EREF. Tell us a little bit about the EREF Scholar program.
Sure. It is one of the most unique programs of its kind. And I say that not as a scholar and not as the CEO of EREF, but really in looking, we actually just completed a review, kind of a landscape scan, if you will, of scholarship programs across the US and across North America. And our program is really unique in the sense that most people, when they apply for a scholarship, expect to get a dollar amount and thank you very much, and you get sent on your way. Our scholarship program invests in the scholar. So for example, if we get an application in and that student says, I've got 3 more years until I graduate, we typically will fund them from the time we start the award until they graduate. So we've had scholars get funding from us from 1 to sometimes 5 years, depending on how long their program is. So we really invest in the scholar. It's typically a significant amount of money for them as a student. And then in addition to that, we work avidly to bring them into various places. So it might be an industry function, for example, that we're at and say, hey, come to this, represent EREF as a scholar, talk to us about your research. Sometimes it's kind of fun. We sent a scholar earlier this year to the Cayman Islands for a conference that happened there. And, not every scholar we get to send to the Cayman Islands,
Right.
but many are perfectly happy going to a technical conference and talk about their research there. But in any case, our goal really is to socialize the program because in many respects, if you look at the world of solid waste management research, it's a pretty small world. And so our goal is to socialize our scholars, one, to make sure that they're aware of all the career opportunities that are available to them when they graduate. But secondly, in reality, no matter where they end up, they are a select few of the brain trust that represents solid waste expertise. There's not a lot of people out there. And I think many times when you sort of peel back the curtain on really many areas of study from a research perspective, you'll find that in most places, the field of researchers isn't that large. It is a few handfuls of key researchers that kind of make their bread and butter in that space. And they're the true experts. They're the ones that sort of live and breathe this every day. And that's what we're trying to build through the program.
I love that. I'm curious. I mean, you gave us a taste of it, but I understand that your work when you were an EREF scholar was on microbiology's impact on decomposition in landfills. Give us the audience a brief overview of why it's something that was important to you to research, and why should the average person take an interest in that? Because I actually think there's probably a pretty good correlation to what you're up to now.
Absolutely. So there are a couple of facets to this. For many who may not be aware, when we throw our garbage away, the vast majority of it does go to a landfill. And when that waste goes into a landfill and it's placed in that type of facility, ultimately we start to see methane being generated. Now, what may not be as intuitive is that methane is not coming from the waste directly. That methane is coming from a whole consortium of microbes. Basically it's a food network within the waste, and it would be the organic materials in that waste mass that are basically being consumed as food by the microbes. Now, when microbes eat waste, they excrete a mixture of primarily methane and carbon dioxide. So what we were trying to understand was a couple things. One is that you have certain conditions that exist in a landfill that suggest that these microbes should not actually start making methane. And so we were wondering, like, what actually helps them get going? What helps that process get going? Because there are conditions that really aren't favorable for these microbes to begin metabolizing the waste. But we do see it happen. We know it happens. We can measure the methane. So we wanted to understand what was that cause and what were the conditions that allowed that to happen, because we thought that could give us some clues as to how to perhaps help control some of the methane. for energy creation. So many landfills today, the large ones, are making energy out of methane. They're turning it into heat, they're turning it into electricity, they're turning it into fuel for garbage trucks and things like that. And then the other part of it is we wanted to understand what happened so that we could better understand how emissions are created in a landfill. And so landfills make methane. That methane could be used for either beneficial purposes of creating energy out of it, which can help offset fossil fuels, or they can create emissions, which we call fugitive emissions, meaning that they escaped and we haven't been able to capture them. And we want to try to reduce those. So that was really the crux of the research, was to try to better understand that so we could develop strategies to help mitigate emissions or to help enhance energy creation from that methane that comes out of a landfill.
I love it. So I want to ask a really dorky question, because I was doing a little research or doing a little reading, trying to understand all this. And correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the things I'm going to look at my notes to make sure I get articulate it right. One of the primary factors that you found to affect the micro demographics was, quote, spatial orientation upon placement of refuse. So I'm curious, does that mean that the actual direction or way we put garbage into a landfill actually affects how it decomposes? And if the answer is yes, what does that mean for how we should think about structuring landfills, building them, or putting trash into them? Or is there a way to think about this that it's less environmentally harmful?
Yeah, well, okay, so you've definitely been reading that 400-page dissertation, so I applaud you for that. Yes, so one of the conditions that happens in a landfill is that the pH gets acidic. And these microbes that can make methane actually operate under neutral pH conditions. And so we were looking within the spatial matrix of the waste mass and saying, well, the pH is at 5. These certain types of microbes that are called methanogens only can metabolize when they're at a pH of 7, a little less than that perhaps. So we're asking the question, why is this happening? And so we were definitely looking at different spatial characteristics within the landfill. So if you think about everything that you throw away, you could have, this morning's coffee grounds sitting next to someone's mattress. So imagine that size, right? Something as big as a mattress next to basically small food waste and things like that. So we knew that there were some things happening in there that likely contributed to seeing the pH increase. And we suspected it had to do with just how the water that enters a landfill, usually it's rainfall, sometimes it's other things. Ultimately, how does it find its way into that waste mass? Because like we as humans, we need water to live, and so do these microbes. And so we knew that those microbes needed water and they needed a food source, and ultimately we would get there. And so what we found is that certainly you could have situations within the landfill where you have a pH 7 area, and a few centimeters away in some cases you could have highly acidic conditions. And so what we found is that these methanogens would find their home in these little pockets of pH 7 and then would expand their way out into these lower pH areas, and they would basically kind of consume the food as they went, which actually caused the pH to neutralize. It caused it to get better. So thinking of it back to your question, what do we do with that information? There were a couple of takeaways. One is that knowing that this happens, is there a way to help do one of two things? And this is going to sound counterintuitive. Can we stop methane formation before it happens? Or can we make it happen more quickly? So almost think of it like a switch. Could we use this to turn it on and off? Because one of the things that people don't realize is that the reason we tend to see a lot of emissions from landfills that aren't captured is because the methane escapes too early. In other words, it escapes before the landfill owner can install a network of wells to actually harvest the methane. So our thought was, if we could turn the switch off until these wells could get installed, and then turn the switch back on, now we've really minimized emissions. Now we're actually capturing methane. We're now offsetting fossil fuels. That's all a good thing. And so our hope was to try to better understand what were the triggers for that. One of the challenges from that research is we found that there is so much heterogeneity in the waste mass that it can be very challenging. Now, Europe has taken a model where they do something called mechanical biological treatment. And what they do is they actually help create a more consistent particle size, and they subject that to some treatment where they could get more of the energy content out of that. The US hasn't adopted that model, perhaps yet, but certainly that is a direction that could go in. And if so, then we could solve and address some of these spatial issues for sure. But as you might imagine, there's a significant cost to be able to do something like that.
It's so fascinating. So it's the things you don't think about but learn in one of these conversations. That's why I do this podcast. I love these kinds of learnings.
Who knew garbage could be so complex, right?
You did, obviously. You and a handful of researchers and folks at EREF. So let's get into EREF now and kind of rewind a little bit. Give us EREF's origin story. Where did the organization get started? And what was it out there originally built to solve or to do?
Yeah, so the story goes that, well, originally we were born under a trade association. But the reason we were born had to do with an experience that one of the waste industry executives had at the time. And I think they had attended it was one of the Ivy League colleges, perhaps might have been Yale, where they attended a seminar. And someone made a statement in that seminar that no field is successful long term without an investment in education and research. And that executive at the time then went back to the trade association and said, what are we doing with education and research? And basically, it was kind of a big goose egg. And so they said, well, we should start a foundation that could help advance research because we certainly have our share of problems, just like any other field has. And if we invest in it, perhaps we can solve some of those problems. And so that was back in 1994. About 4 years later, 1998, there was a recognition that EREF as an organization would be better off if it was unaffiliated with a trade association because many trade associations do advocacy work. And so the idea is that we needed an organization that could do work unfettered, uninfluenced. And so we broke away and became an independent organization so that our pathway to research and education could be objective, it could be credible, it could help inform rather than support a desired position from an advocacy standpoint. And so we broke away and we've been at it ever since. I was the third full-time hire. We now have more than 24 people that work with the organization, a lot of donors and stakeholders. And we have enjoyed the support from the corporate standpoint, but we also have individual donors and we work with a lot of academic institutions to help bring that science to bear. And one of the things we've worked real hard at is that when you're seen as having corporate donors, I think there can be a perspective of like, oh, your work is tainted. And so we worked really hard to develop processes that even though we do receive corporate support, if somebody gives us a check from a company, we don't just accept that and go do whatever they told us. We have a whole process very similar to the National Science Foundation's process in selecting projects and awarding projects and those kinds of things. And so I can make a strong case that even though we receive private support, we are very credible and objective in how we approach, and a lot of that has to do with how we manage our processes and how we award projects.
Given that origin, how would you kind of extrapolate to today as kind of the current focus, the elevator pitch for EREF in today's environment? What are you focused on? And in particular, what are you personally really driving the organization towards as your primary focus?
Yeah, so when we first started, most of the work we did was focused on landfills. Fast forward to today, I'd say less than 50% of the work we're doing is strictly landfill oriented. And so we broadened our work to incorporate recycling, composting, anaerobic digestion, waste to energy. And there's some common challenges that affect all of those types of operations. And so things like forever chemicals, for example, emissions, these are things that doesn't matter whether you own a landfill or you own a waste energy facility or a compost facility, you're still wanting to address the emissions question, right? So we stand in the gap of what's the direction of science for us? What are the research questions that can help propel not only business forward, but help us in developing more reasonable policies, help us understand as a society, how do we make the best choices to help impact things? And so as we look to the future, we're turning even further into what we would call upstream, which would be how do we influence the things that ultimately become waste? And how can we help society reach a point of greater circularity? And, we don't have to be perfect at it because, we know that there's been reports that estimates how circular we are as a global economy. And we're not that circular. We're less than 10% circular. But the other thing that's interesting about that is that we don't need to achieve 100% circularity to achieve a 2-degree decrease in global temperature rise, for example. We can achieve a target by being less than 100% circular. So as we think about where does the foundation fit in all of that, is we understand that when you think about circularity, what's the one thing that really kind of binds circularity together? And it's the waste management aspect of things, whether it's waste reduction, whether it's diverting waste, or whether it's just trying to be as sustainable as possible for the waste that we can't divert or we can't minimize. What do we do with that rather than just assume that there's no value to it? How can we enhance the value? How can we increase sustainability? So that's our focus moving forward, is how do we advance the circularity component of that? We are very big into how to measure things. I'd say the long-standing common threads in a lot of the research we do is that many things are not measured as accurately as they could be measured. Some are
Sure.
not even measured at all. And so if we can more accurately measure them, we can develop other solutions for the future, knowing that, okay, here's where we stand today. Now, how do we begin to change that?
You talk about three kind of principles for this on your website: advancing the science, informing the policy, and growing the field. I'm curious kind of if you could walk us through how you're working on those and how that kind of contributes to that overall mission.
Sure. Well, kind of start in the middle and talk about influencing policy because although we don't do advocacy, most of the policies that we are exposed to really have a lot of science as the core to that policy, or there are citations that are in there. The Clean Air Act, for example. They go into the Clean Air Act, and if you drill down into some of the subparts, you quickly get into numbers. And some of those numbers, many of those numbers are based off of scientific research. And so one of the things that most of your audience probably knows is that science is never static. And some people will say, well, that means science is wrong. No, science is always evolving. Science is always seeking to find the best answer possible. And as we learn more, it helps science evolve more. And so the policies that exist were based off of science, circa whatever date.
Hmm.
And so many times that science changes and it gets better and we know more. And so something as simple as how efficient can we collect the methane from a landfill, since we've been talking about that. There are numbers in the Clean Air Act that say, your gas collection efficiency for a landfill is X, which 20 years ago, that gas collection efficiency number may have been the best we have. Today we know the numbers might be different than that. And so we work to advance the science around some of these core benchmarks for policy building that help make sure that that science is as accurate as possible. And what that leads us to is that perhaps a modified or a changed policy over time that more accurately reflects the state of science. When we talk about advancing science overall, we are less concerned so much with policy per se, but more of just like, what are the questions that are out there? So for example, if we talk about forever chemicals, that's a hot topic these days, right? If we think about forever chemicals or PFAS, the question is, okay, we've seen some science out there that suggests it's pretty nasty stuff. That science is based off of research from the 20,000s. The question today is, knowing that it's been found at both poles, it's been found in most of our blood, we're all still alive. So the question is, okay, how bad is this stuff? And is there a point at which it is pretty nasty? But if it's below that threshold, like lots of things that we get exposed to from, things and cleaning agents that we use to gasoline fumes at the gas pump, is it so small that it's really kind of a negligible impact on our overall health or not? Maybe it's pretty nasty stuff and we have to be concerned with that. So this is an example of some of the work that we're doing to try to achieve a better understanding, because if we think about forever chemicals, the vast majority of those chemicals are in consumer products that ultimately are thrown away. So they end up being received by different waste management facilities, whether that's a recycling facility, a
Right.
landfill, a compost operation. And so these are pretty important questions to want to understand better. One, how much of these chemicals are effectively removed from society via disposal? But then what does that mean from an exposure standpoint? And so,
Sure.
that's just one example, but that's how we sort of help further the knowledge that helps us make better decisions in our daily lives as well.
It leads to a good next question, which is, you operate in a space where you've got to navigate competing interests from folks on both sides of the aisle, stakeholders, both corporate and philanthropic. I'm just kind of curious, how do you think about kind of leading your team through that delicate balance a little bit?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that really many entities, whether they're corporate entities, other nonprofits, have that similar delicate pathway to walk down. You have different stakeholders, whether they're customers, whether they're donors, whether they're those who could use or leverage the information you're putting out, and trying to establishing a sense of trust is really important. And that trust is on multiple fronts. One, if we're going to go ask for proprietary data, for example, from a facility owner, they need to know that we can manage their data responsibly. They also need to understand that as an organization, one of our core values is we have to publish every project that we do. Something has to be published from it. We don't restrict something. We don't get to a result and go, oh, that result's going to be bad. We can't publish that. No, that's not what we do. We publish everything. So, what our argument is that the science that we do ultimately is a rising tide that raises all ships. One of my prior board chairmen had this to say when we talked about the kind of research we did. And he said that I don't care if the research is bad for my company or good for my company. As long as it's right, we can make wise decisions off
Right.
of that. And I remember that now for over a decade because it really stuck with me. And I think that's right. I mean, I think ultimately, if we want the science we do as an organization to be objective and credible, then we need to be able to do that without a anticipated prior outcome. We need to be able to follow the data wherever it leads, and wherever it ends up ultimately is going to be informative information that entities can use to make decisions off of. And so
Right.
that's been a core value for us.
This harkens one of my favorite euphemisms from being a banker, which was, when it came to building models and, you needed to have good data. But in that case, we used to say garbage in, garbage out, which may not actually be the right metaphor to use here.
Right, right.
We talk a lot with a lot of organizations who are in the private sector, a lot of businesses, for-profit companies who are operating at this intersection of doing well, doing good, who are trying to build corporate solutions in very similar, analogous spaces that kind of help us down the path towards greater sustainability in the long run. And obviously, you've got a lot of corporate partners, and you're super familiar with a lot of the conversations we've had. So I'm curious, for your perspective, from a research perspective, from someone who just has a wealth of information, what is the actual science of waste management say about the business benefits for companies who are pursuing circularity or a sustainable alternative in the waste space? Like, what do you think you see or understand from the macro picture that kind of validates what these companies are investing a lot of time, effort, and trying to solve for?
Yeah. I think the motto becomes garbage in, resource out. And in that case, a lot of the corporate side of the waste management sector are looking at the waste streams that come in and trying to, I feel like, do two things with that. One, can we create another revenue stream from this that can benefit the environment while also providing a service to those who need it? And in addition to that, can we mitigate risk that basically avoids added cost of managing waste in the future? And so when we think about that, it really can revolve around, all right, if science can lead us to an answer that can mitigate a risk or reduce a risk with one outcome or another, that's actually an expense reduction for a waste management company. If the science can lead to an alternative solution for waste management, well, that's an additional revenue stream. So, for example, some of the work that we've supported aims to convert waste to a synthetic crude oil, for example. And so, well, if we do that, then we basically can stop pulling fossil-based fuels out of the Earth's crust. So that's one example. Perhaps a little bit more simplistically even is that, let's say, a company that picks up the waste every day is something as simple as, can we just help recycle better? Looking at science that can help advance technologies. In many cases, there's a significant push in the recycling sector right now to advance artificial intelligence and applying the artificial intelligence to robotic sorters. So that accomplishes a couple of things. One, you can get a cleaner sort. One of the biggest challenges you may or may not know in a recycling facility is the contamination, which are non-recyclable materials that ultimately find their way there. And no recycling facility wants that. They prefer a clean feedstock, but you're going to get some of that regardless. And so if we can use AI and technology to sort that, that's a more efficient sort. You get a much better product out the back end that can go to secondary processors to take that recycled plastic and turn it back into a beverage bottle, for example. The other thing that a lot of folks may not realize, though, is that a lot of these recycling facilities have a tremendous number of manual sorters still. We call them pickers. And so if you can use robotics to replace pickers in an area of that facility that has high dust, basically is not as healthy, then you can also improve the working conditions for those that do work there. And so there are a couple of different angles for that.
One of the conversations we've had a few times or a few different ways on in the last couple of seasons is food waste, which I know is a huge part of the equation. I'm curious, kind of from your perspective, if you could help illuminate for folks why that's such a challenging issue in waste management and what the research says about how to best address it.
Yeah, so food waste, when we think about emissions production, for example, whether it's from a landfill or elsewhere, are all going to be derived from organic waste. And most of those organic waste would be food waste. So food waste it creates challenges across the board. You've got food waste going to landfills, exacerbates the emissions from landfills. That's a challenge. Food waste, depending on how it's generated, can even be challenging for compost operations. One of the common things I hear is that, well, we generate all this food waste, let's just send it to a compost facility. And so, one of the things we're looking at on the scientific side of things related to food waste and how we can divert it more efficiently and effectively has to do with what are the hurdles to composting that food waste. And so, kind of going back to the contamination note earlier, so contamination is also a factor at compost facilities. And what we've learned is that compost facilities love a clean feedstock, meaning that there's no baby diapers in there, there's no
Hmm.
packaging, there's no other things. And so if you think about where do we generate food waste? Well, we generate it at home, we generate it in restaurants. There's a concept called front of restaurant waste, which is what we throw away as consumers at that restaurant. If we throw that in the trash cans, it's going to usually be mixed with other things, and those can be problematic from a composting
Yeah.
perspective. The composters would much rather have back of restaurant waste, which you can have a much cleaner stream there when you're scraping off plates and things like that at the dishwashing area, for example. And so we're looking at the science of how can we better manage contamination. I mentioned forever chemicals earlier. One of the other things that's happening is some of the compost facilities are refusing to take any food waste that has any kind of packaging in it, in part because packaging tends to contain these forever
Yeah.
chemicals. And so rather than deal with that, they're saying, well, we don't want it. And so, these things come up and we help to further the science and the understanding around solutions to help. We want to see that food waste go to a compost facility. We want to see that food waste go to an anaerobic digester. We would prefer, and many landfill owners would also say this, they would prefer not to see food waste go to a landfill because it's harder for them to manage these landfills because it degrades so quickly that it becomes these fugitive emissions, so you can't capture it as
Yeah.
efficiently. And we make a lot of it. Right now, one of the fastest growing components of waste going to landfills is food waste. And part of that isn't necessarily that we're generating dramatically more food waste, although we are to some extent. It has to do with the fact that we're doing a much better job recycling other materials. And so that's making the percentage of food waste in a landfill go up.
Right.
And so that is creating some similar challenges in greenhouse gas emissions as well.
Interesting.
And food waste is very decentralized if you think about it. I mean, it's in lots of different things. You get food waste from the point of farming all the way to the point of consumption and during the preparation and processing of that food, all the way through the supply chain.
Well, and composting itself is so fragmented, I think, in how communities, parts of the country, cities
Absolutely.
deal with it. I'll point folks in the show notes. We've done a couple of great episodes in this space. Matt Rogers, who started Mill Industries, which I'm a huge fan of. We've got one of the home composters at home that I love. Nick Whitman at Divert, who is doing food waste into natural gas and through anaerobic digestion. So we've covered a lot of these. I think it's a really fascinating space. Another one, that a conversation we've had was with Christy Keeler of Trashy, who's working on textile recycling, kind of trying to figure out the circularity from the fashion industry. Because I know textiles are such an interesting, unique segment. Curious for your take on the science underpinning the issue there and what makes that such a challenging area to achieve real circularity in textiles.
Yeah, so textiles, especially with the furthering of the fast fashion movement, has been a real challenge. Fast fashion tends to make broad use of what we call blended fabrics, which would be a fabric that consists of both a cotton fiber and a synthetic fiber, like a polyester or something like that. So you've got both of these fibers that make up the fabric of a shirt, jacket, what have you. And in many respects, it can be very hard if you think about, well, can we recycle the polyester fabric, the polyester threads? Yes, we can. Can we do something with the cotton? Yes, we can. But when they're together, you can't. So we funded some research to try to figure out how can we best separate those different types of materials as a form of recycling the textiles. And if we could do that, if we could separate the cotton from the synthetic fibers, now we have an opportunity to recycle those fibers in one stream and do something with the cotton fibers in the other. And so we're furthering that work because otherwise, textiles is one of the more challenging waste materials and waste streams to manage and to deal with. And most textiles ultimately end up in a landfill. But as I just described, cotton, even though it's organic, degrades very, very slowly, which could be beneficial for gas recovery. But in many respects, especially if you don't have a lot of moisture, it doesn't degrade very much at all. Synthetic fibers, of course, don't degrade at all. So you're really losing an opportunity by putting it in a landfill when it is certainly recoverable. But the technology and the approach and how to do that needs to advance a little bit further.
Interesting. I mean, you really are at the forefront of so much new innovation. I'm curious, as you kind of look at the field, the science field in front of you, and think about, who's doing interesting research, what's getting you excited kind of in the next big innovations around waste, or even just broadly in climate tech. But what are you seeing out there? Like, who's doing interesting innovations or interesting research that you think folks should check into?
Well, I'll start with some of the work we're doing and then kind of broaden out to some things that others are doing. But a lot of the things we're doing as we talk about, climate change, and particular with some rather strong weather events, happening in recent years, we've got
Yeah.
these challenges that can really create a lot of damage for society. So if we can better measure how emissions are formed and we can measure like what kind of emissions are created, then that gives us a better perspective on how to potentially address that. So, for instance, we mentioned earlier about methane emissions coming from landfills, and some of the transformative work we're doing right now is how do we better measure that? And you would think that this is just as easy as like slapping a ruler down or something. Like I can measure that as 1 foot. But when it comes to landfill emissions, it's actually quite challenging. And it's one of the most challenging analogs to try to measure emissions from. You've got these huge, huge facilities, hundreds of acres in size. In some areas, they are literally the highest point of elevation in the entire county. So they actually create their own microclimates around landfills. And so when we talk about trying to measure emissions, these things are very challenging because of that. So we just finished a study where we brought 17 different technologies to a single landfill at the same time to try to understand how accurate these different technologies could measure emissions. So we had satellites, we had aircraft, we had helicopters, we had drones, we had people with measurement devices in pickup trucks and golf carts, and people walking with backpacks, sniffers, if you will, to test that all at the same time. And what's fascinating about that is we actually released methane at a known rate. It's kind of like kind of creating a benchmark, right? So
Sure.
if I released at a rate of 1, and you measured at a rate of 1, then you're 100% accurate. That's how we did it. And what was surprising is actually how much variability there was in these different technologies. And so it tells us that we're not there yet. Like there's no silver bullet, and many of these technologies still need a lot of tweaking, fine tuning, and further research to get better at it. So those are some of the things that if we can get to a point where we can measure these things directly with whatever technology it may be, we can actually accurately then estimate how much methane emissions are occurring from landfills. Because what folks may not realize is that the quantity of methane that comes out of a landfill, those are all modeled estimates.
Mhm.
They're not actually direct measurements. And so they're modeling them and saying, well, this is basically what we think the emissions are. In reality, they're based off of a lot of assumptions. So that's one. But then I turned towards thinking about, well, how can we, once we measure it, then how can we try to develop solutions? And some of the things I think are fascinating. The big premise behind climate change is that we have too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, right? So if we can find opportunities to remove the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, well, now we're on to something. And I think we've been focused on reducing, which is great, but there are technologies that are coming online now that allow us to literally pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and turn it back into something like carbonate rock. In other words, put it right back into the geologic cycle where it came from, which effectively eliminates it as a problem anymore. And so these to me are fascinating because if I think about that, I think, well, where could we find places across the United States that basically are big holes in the ground, have a lot of potential space where we could put carbonate minerals that we pulled out of the atmosphere to reduce the CO2 concentrations? And landfills have that potential to be places for that. So to me, that's fascinating because if the technology can get there, we could literally have situations where we're pulling CO2 out of the air. There are some other technologies that are using that from more of a chemical approach, but they're also doing more of a biological approach. So they're taking areas where we have high concentrations of CO2, and they're funneling that high CO2 air through something like a greenhouse where they're using it to grow crops. And because you have high concentrations of CO2 and because plants pull CO2 out of the air, they actually grow faster and they can produce more quickly. So effectively, you can remove carbon dioxide that way too. Those things are fascinating to me because it represents kind of the potential future that we may, need to be looking at if we continue to see CO2 emissions increase. We're starting to do things that are having an impact, but the concern is maybe it's not having impact fast enough.
Right. What is one, I mean, just taking it down to the personal level then, what's one waste management practice that you think any one of our listeners, whether it's a company or an individual, could adopt right away or could think about to help make the greatest possible impact in our day-to-day lives?
Yeah, I would say educate yourself on what to put in a recycling bin and what not to put in a recycling bin. We call it wish cycling in the field, where somebody really wants this to be recyclable and I'm going to put it in the recycling bin. And typically what happens is it goes to a recycling facility where it's sorted out as contamination and it gets a free ride to a landfill. So now you've just basically doubled the emissions to get that piece of waste from point A to point B. But if you even zoom backwards a little bit, I think we could all make better choices in our consumer habits. I mean, do we really need to buy something that's single use all the time? I understand the need to do that in some cases, but can we make choices and have a reusable water bottle instead? If you're going back and forth to work every day, well, that's a pretty strong habit, right? So you could presumably bring something that's reusable. Strangely enough, the vast majority of gas stations and convenience stores across the United States do not have recycling bins. And many times we find ourselves traveling and we've got all this stuff in the car. What am I going to do with
Right.
it? And so something as simple as, hey, once we get to wherever we're going or if we're going back home, the vast majority of Americans have recycling programs. And so let's just bring that home. We'll put it in a bag, bring it home. So those are all things that can help offset the consumption of virgin resources for sure. Outside of the consumer side of things, if we think about it, most of the times we as consumers operate like a poker player does at a poker tournament, right? We're sitting there and whether we win or lose is largely based off of the hand that we're dealt.
Hmm.
And so in that respect, we as consumers are largely managing or dealing with the kinds of products that are sold on the shelf. The vast majority of those products today contain flexible film plastics, which are not recyclable. So, in many respects, what can we do to help push manufacturers to develop more sustainable options for packaging? What can we do to help change our habits and, if possible, do things like buy in bulk rather than buy in single use? So these are all things that we can do. The whole climate change issue didn't start with one thing. It started with a whole variety of different things. And the solution to climate change is probably going to follow a similar path. There's not a one size fits all kind of a thing. And it doesn't have to be perfect. I think we just need to be able to take a step. It doesn't have to be the perfect step.
Yep.
But in my opinion, it has to be a well-educated step. You have to be able to care enough and get enough information that allow you to make what you think is a rather informed decision. And we won't always get it right, but if we can at least be curious enough to try to understand more of what's going on, then we'll get it right more often than not.
Yeah. So EREF is based in North Carolina, which has had a really rough week with extreme weather events. As we record this, I'm getting news alerts about a Category 5 hurricane hitting the western side of Florida, which will be the second in 2 weeks in the southeast region of the United States. We're constantly bombarded with negative headlines, and a lot of them recently about the changing climate. And I think it's really easy for most folks to feel like we can't do enough fast enough to make a difference, and we can't, it's hard to stay inspired or hopeful. And I'm curious what inspires or motivates you to keep doing the work and building towards a better future in light of that. Like, how do you think about, the phrase I use is defeating defeatism. How do you think about defeating defeatism when you're working kind of really centrally in this space every day with your team?
So you're probably asking the wrong person. I think I'm an eternal optimist, so it's hard for me to see a glass that's half empty. But I would say that we can't afford to get the science wrong, because I think if we get the science wrong, or if we do nothing, that's the ultimate defeatism right there. Because what kind of direction does that give anybody?
Yeah.
It gives them none. So I'd say making sure that organizations like ours, and we're not the only organization that's advancing science out there, but it's going to take all of us working together to help bring solutions that the average consumer, the average person in society can understand. Okay, what's my part, and perhaps what's the role of broader society, whether that's technology, whether that's policy, and that kind of thing. But with all that, the common thread to me that helps overcome defeatism is just persistence.
Mhm.
I've had this advice from multiple mentors over my life, is that you don't have to be the smartest person in the room, but you do have to be the most persistent. And if you can be persistent, you're going to get places that most people will have given up, miles before you. And I think that's true with climate change. It is tough to hear these headlines. I'm actually from Western North Carolina originally, and so it was hard for me to see the devastation that occurred there for sure. And it can feel hopeless in the moment. But I think that these things also inspire. When we look back, we'll go, wow, look at how quickly we've been able to recover from this. And kind of going back to the waste aspect of things, that's another element to all of this climate change deal is disaster debris is a big part, managing disaster debris effectively. But being able to feel like you're part of something bigger, I think is really important, because looking to the impacts of things like hurricane, I think in that moment, it can feel really defeating. I'm sitting here in my house, I have no power, I have no water, and neither do my neighbors, and the road is completely covered with trees. How am I going to get out of this? We got to find food. And, what you find is in those moments, people come together. I think when it comes to climate change, it's a little different because climate change can feel a little less tangible than, having to clear a road out from a hurricane. But nonetheless, I think these are things that need organizations like ours to provide that vision, because it can feel esoteric. It can feel like, well, what does me bringing home a bag of recyclables on our home vacation instead of throwing them away at the gas station, how is it really going to change things? Well, in reality, those little things add up and can create huge impact. And so those are things that if we can make sure that people know the impact they're having, it can feel more tangible, right? I did this, and if we say, okay, well, if you and everybody else do this at least once or twice over the summer, wow, it affects this change. And that's the storytelling that we're getting into as we move forward as well, is how can we tell that story that people are making a difference and can make a difference, and you don't have to feel defeated. It's something we can all, be persistent on, and eventually, we'll get to the finish line.
Awesome. Where can folks go to find out more? Where do you want to send folks to follow you and EREF?
Certainly come to our website, www.erefdn.org. Of course, we're on all the social media channels as well, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, those kinds of things. But certainly our website has all of the most recent information. As I said earlier, all of the science that we fund, we publish, all of it's freely available. So anybody can access that. And certainly if anybody has any questions and they can't get the answer on our website, feel free to reach out, give us a shout. You'll find us pretty available, and we're always happy to take questions or help people out.
Awesome. We'll make sure all that is in the show notes for folks to easily access as well. Thank you so much for your time today and the incredible work you guys do. It's been a lot of fun to talk trash for an hour.
I love talking trash.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bryan Staley. We appreciate you. Huge thanks to Bryan Staley for joining us today on Consensus in Conversation. You can find out more about Bryan and the Environmental Research and Education Foundation at their website, erefdn.org. That's erefdn.org. We'll also have all the links for that and to connect with them on socials in the show notes. As always, you can email us at cic@consensus-digital.com. That's cic@consensus-digital.com. You can also message me directly on LinkedIn and Threads at ckgaughan. That's at ckgaughan. Send us your questions, comments, ideas for future guests. We love the feedback. If you've enjoyed this episode, please take a second to leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. It's so helpful to grow our reach, adding new people to the conversation, and helping us continue bringing you more of the awesome talks with business leaders you want to hear from. Thanks, everyone. We'll be back next week with a brand new episode. Consensus in Conversation is hosted by me, Conor Gaughan, and executive produced by me and Jeff Rock. Our producer is Will Gatchell, with editing by the team at Reasonable Volume. Special thanks to the Consensus team, including creative director Kate Tucker and Greg Harrigal on research. Consensus in Conversation is a podcast by Consensus Digital Media, produced in association with Reasonable Volume.